Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our series of webinars. My name is Tara Willsworth. I handle marketing here at Prospiant. We have our usual panelists, Johnny and Mark, who are going to talk to you about frequently asked questions that they've heard about cannabis cultivation. One thing I wanted to mention is that we've not yet scheduled the next 6 months of webinars, but we will be doing that soon. We were talking right before this webinar started about doing some more in-depth analysis on topics that we have spoken about before, but very detailed, very technical. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye on our channel. The next one I'm going to be scheduling is powdery mildew prevention. So that should be in July or August. So keep an eye on our channel to see when that gets scheduled. It's usually the third week of the month. We do have a big trade show next month, so it might be a little bit late. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Johnny and Mark to do a little introduction and then get started.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Johnny Burgoon here. Really today our goal is to walk through our top 20 most frequently asked questions about cannabis and hemp, and we've kind of put those into a grouping of the most common ones. I'm the head solutions architect here at Prospiant, and I also have here today is Mark. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a systems integration engineer here at Prospiant. I have my degree in environmental engineering, been under company for about 4 or 5 years, really focused on just the systems that go inside of a cannabis cultivation facility.
One thing I forgot to mention was that if anybody has any questions, please use the live chat feature and we will answer them as we go through the presentation. We won't wait until the end to do a Q&A. So if you have a question, just pop it into the chat.
Great. So we'll get started here. So probably one of the most commonly asked questions that we get is, do I grow indoor, outdoor, or in a hybrid greenhouse? And really, that's dependent. We always say it depends on what your end product is. So, if you're in a state where you're just growing hemp, you may want to go with an outdoor range, something of more size where you're just trying to get girth. And then obviously, if you're in a high THC cannabis environment, you want to start looking towards the hybrid and indoor type greenhouses. And that's just for controllability, but also for turns. Outdoor, you may get 1 to 2 turns if you're using an autoflower type product. Whereas the indoor and the hybrid, you can get up in the range of 5 turns a year, 5.2 turns a year, to be exact on the indoor. So it really just depends on the capacity you need and the end product you're going to develop. Second is, should we grow from seeds or clone? And again, it comes down a lot to expertise. Buying feminized seeds is fairly simple. However, you really just need to be able to identify the plants as they're growing. Clones is an easy process because they typically take on the personality of the plant it comes from. So, from that aspect, it's usually a lot safer bet than trying to identify seeds or trusting seed suppliers, if you will.
Yeah, and also just with clones, they're going to be more expensive than the seeds are going to be, but you're going to be able to produce the same product every single time. Whereas your seeds, you might get, you might have a bad batch here or there. Clones is going to be more exact, but a little bit more expensive on that side of things.
Wouldn't you make your own clones? I know this sounds like a daft question, but once you have your plant, couldn't you just then continue to make clones from there?
Yeah, so if you're growing mother plants, which you're basically just trying to get them as big as possible so you can cut clones off of them, you can definitely do that. You can get upwards of 100, 200 cuts off of a single mother. But when you start cutting from a mother, there's only a certain time period that you can continue to cut from them. It's not an endless cycle of free clones. So you have to make sure you keep the process going of making sure you're regrowing your mothers and basically keeping that process suitable for your operation.
Right.
Yeah. And good point there. When you're growing mother plants, you're keeping them in a veg state basically for a long period of time. So you're just trying to get them to continually veg and just produce a lot of new growth that can be taken for cuttings. The next one is, how much pesticide do I need for my cannabis plants? And what I've seen here, Mark, is just a ton of states limiting use of pesticides, when they can be used, how long they can be used, and a lot more people are going to an integrated pest program where they're using insects to take care of other insects. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, in the ideal world, you don't have to use any type of pesticides, right? Like that's the way it should be done. It's not always the case. Really, the biggest thing to kind of take into account when looking at pesticides is what can I do before I need to use anything? What can I put insect screens on wherever my intakes are? Can I use HEPA filters somewhere on an HVAC ducting? There's a lot of like precautionary things that you can do to kind of get away from that, but you never really want to be spraying or anything, especially during the flowering state within an indoor grow or a hybrid greenhouse side of things.
Yep. And number 4 here is how much fertilizer do I need for my cannabis plants? And I'm going to talk strictly more about the cannabis side, Mark, where we're talking the 3 phases: the cutting stage, the vegetative stage, and then obviously the flowering stage. But what are the typical levels of fertilizers they need in those grow periods?
Yeah, so it's going to be different for all 3. Obviously, you're going to have a higher amount during your flowering stage than you will your veg stage, and then they're all the way to your seedling and cutting stage. On your seeding and cutting stage, when we're kind of talking about a ratio, it's going to be the NPK, so it's going to be your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the 3 main elements that you're looking to have in your fertilizer. Seedling and cutting stage, you might be anywhere from like a 1:1:2 ratio up to a 1:1:1 ratio. It's going to be on the lower end, pretty equal distribution between the two of all 3 of them. Vegetative, you really want to be giving it a lot more nitrogen. So on that ratio, it might be, you might have a 12:6:6, or you might have a 12:4:6. There's different ones. Every cultivator is going to have a different secret recipe that they have, but that's kind of a general topic there. And then in the flowering, and when you're trying to get the buds to produce, you're going to need more potassium and less nitrogen. So here you might be looking at like a 5:7:10 ratio for the fertilizer that you're going to be feeding to these plants.
Great. And now the next subject is one of my favorite, is how much light do I need, right? So a lot of people fail on the light levels needed also in the different stages. And really, again, this is going to be determined by the type of structure you're using. Obviously, if you're growing indoors, you have to provide 100% of the light levels that are needed. And then if you're growing in a greenhouse with a glass roof or a polycarbonate roof, it's all about the supplemental lighting. So how much light you get in your area on a regular basis, and then how much extra you have to provide to keep the light level at the intensity you need for the time period that you need. Mark, can you walk through each of the stages of the plants?
Yep. Yeah. And so with that, when you're determining light levels, the biggest thing to basically take into consideration is your actual photo period. So, when you're doing flowering and you might only be giving light to your plants for 10 to 13 hours, usually typical is right around 12-12 split. You're going to want to be blasting it with higher light intensity because it's actually only receiving light through a shorter period of time than if you were in the vegetative stage. So, when you're in the germination stage, you're looking for much lower light, anywhere up from 100 to 200 micromoles. The seedling stage, you might be moving up from the 400 to 600, and that's not going to be an immediate change. You don't go from 200 micromoles to 600 the next day. That's going to shock the plant. You kind of want to gradually increase it. And then during the flowering stage, every cultivator is going to have their difference. We've seen people go up from 30 DLI all the way up to like a 62, 65 DLI. So there's a lot of difference. It's all going to be dependent on the strain and exactly what you're looking to get out of that room. But with flowering, it's usually going to be 12 on, 12 off, and just make sure that you kind of account for those equations to make sure that you're getting that DLI based off the micromoles and light intensity that you're actually supplying to the plant at any given time.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Another one, number 6 here is, what kind of growing medium should I use for my cannabis plants? And really, we've seen just about every type of growing method out there. It really comes down to the method you want to use. and what your processes are surrounding that. So we've seen everything from live soil grown in the ground to cocoa perlite, rock wool, hydroponic systems. We've seen cracky systems. We've people can grow plants pretty much in any medium they want to. It's just how are you going to build your system around those? Probably the most common out there is to start them in rock wool blocks and transfer them to cocoa core bags. Some of them use the compressed cocoa core that comes in a bag already, and they just add water and it expands, and they put their blocks down in there. But we have worked with many people that are using live soil and live compost type mediums, and we've even seen some just strictly doing deep water culture, but very few in between. The majority of them are starting their cuttings in rock wool and then transferring them to a compressed core bag out
Is
there.
deep water culture same as hydroponic?
Yes, it's a form of it. Yes, it is. There's a nutrient film technique, which is where they grow the plant in a tube basically and run the liquid across the roots. And then there's the type where they grow on a raft almost, or a cup, where the roots are submerged down in the water. So we have seen those two. Just typically when you get into a high commercial production, those are a little labor intensive, and they go more for the rolling bench style growth.
Okay.
But it comes with its own headaches, right? They have to dispose of those. They have to get rid of those. You've got the material from the bag to deal with. You've got the regrind and compost of everything else that has to happen also. So it really just comes down to what you want your process to be and how you want to grow, and how much you're growing, obviously, because speed is another issue. You can't just throw people at every process, particularly when you're in areas that the price per pound pressure is continuing. Okay, Mark, how about this one? Number 7, what yield and CBD THC ratio might I expect from my plants? And I know here we have both. We're talking hemp and cannabis. So let's talk about those two.
Yeah, and so those numbers are going to be completely different when you go from hemp to either a medical cannabis plant or just recreational plant. But so when you're looking at hemp, you're going to be looking anywhere about 5.5% of average CBD content, but then the THC percentage, which is going to be the major difference, is going to be 0.3% or less. So that's a legal limit. That's basically what is changing your license from having a hemp plant to an actual cannabis plant, is going to be that 0.3%. I think the average content is about 0.28%, just to make sure they stay under that. And then when you're growing actual cannabis for medical or recreational use, your THC percentage is going to be significantly higher. So it could be, there's stuff on the market that can be anywhere from 10% THC up to 35% THC. A big craze is around the high THC. The higher you can get it, the better. But right around average is going to be anywhere from 20 to 28-ish%, and you're coming out of that plant.
Great. Number 8 here. How do I sell my hemp or cannabis for processing? And again, and Tara, you might be able to chime in here, but everything to me is understanding the market. And this should be done even probably before you design or develop your facility. Is you have to think about the amount of product that you're going to be producing and who has the need for it, where the demand is, right, in the market. And you should understand those customers and their volumes needed before you even start processing. And we've had customers who actually enter into agreements prior to them starting up, simply to get a head start on being able to move their product when they're done. Obviously, it can be frozen, and that's popular today, but it's not desired. It has some damaging aspects to the terpene level, so they really prefer to move it as it's harvested or with a very short shelf life. So really, this is about getting out, understanding the market, understanding the dispensaries, what they're moving, what products they're moving, and then that should really tell you the type of cannabis you should go after and the processes for processing it. Number 9, why is it so important to choose female plants above male plants? Mark, you want to touch on that one?
Yep. Yeah. So you're always looking for the female hemp or the female cannabis plants. That's not to say male cannabis plants are completely thrown out and they're disregarded in every aspect. But the female plants are going to be the ones that are creating the buds. That's what you're looking for. That's what's creating your business, money and revenue and everything. But they're just going to have the higher THC and CBD oils in them. But so you're always looking at that. With male plants, they're going to be producing a pollen that's basically going to fertilize the female plant, which is going to create seedlings within your bud, which is undesired. So that's why you really got to make sure you're only putting female plants into production and taking male plants away, so you don't have any seedlings being produced within the plants. Now we've seen some facilities where they have male plants on site and they just keep them in their separate room and use those for pollen, using the pollen from them just to help with those female plants here and there. But yeah, that's in general. We're looking for female plants almost all the time.
So when you're planting from seed, you don't know what you're going to get, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a female seed.
Well, they do have feminized seeds out there for purchase,
Oh, yes.
where somebody has harvested them, but there is some risk to that, right? Getting them mixed or not knowing. And plants can also hermaphrodite. They can actually change from a female plant to a male plant. So it's important that people just really understand that the desire is to have the female plant, and the male produces pollen, which when the female plant is pollinated, the THC levels go down. They're not as potent. So it really comes down to just your process and being able to identify the plants, but also you can protect yourself by pretty much buying feminized seeds already from somebody, but you still have to check those. So and it leads us into our next question: is how and when can I detect plant gender? And the two plants are extremely different. Right when the plant starts to flower a little bit, the females get like 2 white hairs. I call them Guy Fieri. They look like they got the white spikes coming out of it, and then the males actually start to produce pollen pods. So they look like little seed pods, but they're actually full of pollen. So you can see them that, but a lot of guys who are really good at it can actually tell long before that, because of the spacing in between the nodes and things like that are much tighter on a female than on a male. So it takes a little bit of time. And, I even thought at one point that might be another subject for an in-depth identifier, where we could sit down and just show the differences between the plants for those out there struggling with it. But in short, you still have to watch your plants all the way up until they flower to really 100% understand that they're going to be a female plant.
When would if they're a hermaphrodite, when would they change? Is there a set time when they would change, or
No? And it really comes down to the photo period, right? We've heard of plants beginning to hermaphrodite when they have light leaks in the overhead canopy, shade or blackout screen or anything like that. And so I don't think there's a certain time limit, but certainly it would probably have to do it before it gets into the flower stage, obviously, or before they open up.
right? Moving on to questions 11 to 20 then.
Yeah, number 11. So how long should my cannabis plants germinate and propagate? Mark, you want to touch on that one?
Yep. Yeah, and so there's going to be a couple differences here. So if you're looking and you've had your grow medium prepared correctly, your seeds are in a cool, dark place, you should see tiny stems starting to sprout out of the soil within about a week, sometimes a little bit earlier. There's different variables that are going to affect that timeline, such as CO2 and just humidity within the pod, whatever you're doing it in. And then when the stems of the seedlings reach 2 to 4 inches, they kind of need to start being transplanted into larger pots so that you have the ample space for the roots to kind of disperse throughout. Everybody is going to have a different way of doing it. Different strains are going to have different timelines with it, but for the most part, that that week to 2 weeks is going to be the baseline for it, and then it can kind of be different from here and there.
We do have a question in the chat. Can you speak to the benefits or disadvantages of using auto-flowering cannabis? Cannabis ruderalis, I probably butchered that, where the plant switches from vegetative growth to the flowering stage based on age, and you don't need the 12-12 life cycle that other cannabis varieties need to flower.
So the biggest benefit of this here is going to be when you're doing outdoor growing. So a lot of the times historically people have been getting one turn, you plant it early in the season and you harvest it right at the end, and that's kind of what you get for the year. With auto flowering, you can start it early, harvest halfway through, and then do a second go because the photo period doesn't affect it. Whereas if you were doing an outdoor grow without auto flowering, you're only going to enter that flowering period based off the sunlight that's coming through that you can have no control on unless you're on an indoor environment. So if you have a really big outdoor grow, this is going to be super beneficial. This is going to help you basically double the amount of revenue you can get for the season. And John, I don't know if you have any different aspects of that, but that's definitely going to be the biggest component of it.
No, that was perfect. That strain really was developed to be able to take an outdoor crop from a single to a double turn every year.
Are there any disadvantages to that?
It really comes down to your territory, right? It's whether how early your springs come in and how late your falls go, because they can still be hindered by poor weather. If you're in an up north territory, you still may not get the full 2 turns out of it. And if you had a late spring start and a late, you could still only get 1 turn, but it's there for, to catch a break, you can actually get 2 turns out of it.
Okay.
So it's difficult to answer that because it doesn't answer everything, but it does allow you to make harvest a little bit sooner. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
We could probably even get a few experts on that. We have a few growers that are using that process right now, kind of testing it out in the Midwest. So, maybe we'll have more information on that later also.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Great. And then number 12 here, when should I switch my cannabis plants from the vegetative growth stage to the flowering stage? Mark, you want to hit that one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is going to be another question that's going to be a low variable, basically just dependent on who's growing it, what strains are growing. But for the most part, you're going to be having for this, you're going to 60 days from when you're germinating it. There's going to be difference if you go straight into a veg room that's dedicated just for vegetative growth. You might be in there for 3 weeks. You could be in there for 4 weeks, 2 weeks. We've seen difference between from cultivator to cultivator, but that's pretty much when you're going to start taking away that 18-hour photo period, putting it into a flowering room, and slowly starting to bring that down to that 11 to 12-hour stage. But with this, there's different ways you can do it, and it's going to be, if you keep it in the vegetative stage longer, it's just going to be a bigger, bushier plant, which is going to require more trimming throughout the flowering process. So every cultivator is going to have their own specific amount of days. Some people, it's exactly 21 days or exactly 23 days in veg. And then they move it directly into flower. It's all going to be dependent on what type of plant you're looking to harvest, and if you're looking more at just biomass in general, or if you're looking for actual premium flower.
Yep, thank you. Number 13, does frost affect CBD, CBG, or THC levels? And really, that's a question mainly for the outdoor crop, right? So it's usually around hemp. And although frost doesn't impact those levels in hemp a ton, what usually comes with cold weather is short and light days. So they kind of go hand in hand. Does it hurt your yield? Yes. Does it hurt the return? No. But typically when it's colder outside, we're in the shorter daylight period days. So that question that comes across, it's really, they're kind of asking the question maybe is how long can they let their season go on? And we would always say it's after the first frost, there's such little light, you're not going to get a turn out of it anyways, and the temperatures are going to continue to get colder. but frost itself doesn't hurt THC levels in hemp. And they have studies out there that have really shown that. So we can direct you to those studies if somebody's got an in-depth question on that. Mark, here's a good one on the water. What should my target pH and EC be? Number 14.
Yep. So before you even get into like the EC of the water that you're delivering, you want to make sure that you're taking into account the pH of your actual soil. This could be anywhere from 5.8, 6 just up to 7. So slightly acidic. But then from there, once you kind of get that baseline, you're going to be looking for EC levels that are going to be different for each stage of the plant. So for hemp plants, you might be anywhere from 0.5 to 0.8 as an EC, and then going all the way up to the 1.1 towards the end of the growth period, where during more of like the actual cannabis plants where you're looking for those buds, should be between 1.2 to 1.5, and then it can increase all the way up from like 1.8 up to 2.4. We've seen some really high numbers up in the 2.4. But really anything higher than 2.5, there's been some studies out there that kind of show that begins to reduce your yield. But so there's a happy medium that you're going to want to go through with each stage. But again, it's not going to be the exact same from cultivation facility to cultivation facility. Everybody's going to have their own little twist on how they do it. But for the most part, those are going to be your general guidelines there.
Mark, how important is the incoming water, the understanding of the incoming water?
It's extremely crucial. You want to know exactly what you're feeding your plants, especially if you're doing a hydroponic system and you're not doing a live soil system. If you're not doing a live soil system, you have to deliver that plant every nutrient that they use during their life cycle. So you have to know exactly what the ratio of fertilizer you're feeding to that plant is, how much of that ratio you're actually feeding to the plant at any given time. And then you can get even as deep into doing like micro pulsing irrigation, where you feed for a minute, let the soil media dry out for a little bit, and then irrigate it for another minute. You might do it 30, 40 times a day.
Great. All right, number 15. How do I mitigate odor when growing cannabis? So I'm going to break this into two categories here. One is the internal odor, like that your workforce is going to be subjected to, and then also external odor that goes out into the public air. We have a lot of states and localities that are really tracking down on odor from these facilities. So I'm going to first talk about the external odors leaving the building. Obviously, the most common is still carbon filters. They will put in giant carbon filters that they can exhaust the air to the outside. But the most common is probably the masking agents, where they near the exhaust fan they put on a simple spray for that basically when the fan kicks on, it sprays this masking agent as the air goes out, kind of like a Febreze, if you will, to help deaden that smell. And then those are probably the two of the biggest kind, wouldn't you say, Mark? The carbon filters and the masking agents.
Yep. Yeah, those are going to be your biggest ones for sure.
And then more for the internal people, you're still looking at the carbon filters for the internal rooms because they do get quite pungent, especially when you're running at higher temperatures and things like that. But also they use some ozone generators, which help deaden that smell pretty well. Anything else there, Mark, that might be out there technology wise today?
Just on the ozone generators, some people are using these. A lot of people are still kind of weary about them because it's using oxidation within the actual zone to get rid of this smell.
Good point.
And that's not to say that it won't have positive effects on the actual smell within the zone, but that ozone is going to react with anything and everything it comes into contact with. So there's a chance it can interact with the actual plant itself, cause harm to the plant, reduce your THC and CBD levels. So we don't typically see these as much, but people have been using them here and there in the industry.
Great. Number 16, what is the ideal relative humidity for cannabis plants? You want to touch on that one, Mark?
Yep. And then so based line here, this is going to be 40 to 50%. That's what you're looking for in the zone. That is not going to be your everyday relative humidity in the zone by any means. When you're in the clone stage, you might be at full saturation. You might want that room to be as humid as possible, and then start bringing it down slightly. But even in the vegging zone, you're still going to have a higher relative humidity than if you were in the flowering zone. So in the veg, you might be upwards of 60-65%. And that's not because you can't control it, but just because that's where your set point is, and you want it that high for that plant. But when you get into the flowering zone, flowering aspect of the life cycle, you want to start bringing that relative humidity down, because if you don't, that's when you start getting botrytis, just different diseases, bud rot, the whole 9 yards with it. So that's where you want to be closer to that 40-ish range, 40 to 50%, especially right before harvesting. You want to make sure you can bring that down as low as possible.
Yeah, thank you. How do I know when my plants are ready for harvest? Well, so I don't know, Mark, you might have something in on this, but basically you can look at it and tell when it's ready by the changing in the color of the trichomes. When they start to get that kind of amber color on all the little hairs that are on and around the bud is when they're typically ready. I don't know if there's some magic way, Mark, of testing for it out there in the market, but basically everybody does it almost like they do any crop, corn, tomatoes, whatever, is when they get ripe, which is that auburn color, if you will.
Yeah, and just the stigma of the plant too, like the little hair-like strands, those are gonna basically turn from white to orange, and then a day after they turn orange, they're gonna start curling inwards. So if you ever see any final products of LinkedIn of somebody's product, those strains are always going to be orangish, and if they're white, that means they might have harvested a little bit earlier.
Yep. Great. Next, number 18. What is the best harvesting method? By far, almost everybody out there in the cannabis world, the medical cannabis world and recreational world, is still doing hand harvesting. It is still the most popular method. Really, we don't see much of the machine harvesting except on the hemp side, is where when they have large fields and things like that. But by far, almost everybody is doing the hand harvesting, and that's obviously so they don't lose as much crop as they're harvesting. Any input there, Mark?
Not too. Yeah. It's just if you're doing machine harvesting, these, especially in the cannabis world, if you're selling for $3,000 a pound, it is a very hard pill to swallow when you might get rid of 2 plants from the machine harvesting that you didn't want to. So.
Right. In number 19, this is a very popular subject. We're actually, I think one of our next in-depth technology reviews is going to be on VPD and dehumidification and preventing powdery mildew. But Mark, what is VPD when growing cannabis?
Yeah, so VPD is just going to be your vapor pressure deficit. And essentially what this is just a measurement of the difference between the moisture in the air versus how much moisture that air can hold in total. So if it was at 100% versus what it's actually at. And your goal is basically to get your VPD down into a specific range. And the reason why that is the stomata of the plant is going to be working at a certain rate. That's all going to be dependent on the VPD in that room. So it's directly correlated to relative humidity as well as temperature. But if you have too low of a VPD, the stomata of that plant, which is essentially taking in the carbon dioxide and releasing the oxygen, is going to completely close. If you have it in that correct range you're looking for, you're going to be able to control the nutrient uptake, the CO2 uptake, the O2 release. And then if you have too high of a VPD, basically that stomata is just taking in, letting out. It's not actually utilizing it for anything. It's kind of just going rampant. So it's really important that your VPD is in that right chart. And if you just look up on Google and just type in a cannabis VPD chart, there's going to be 1,000 out there. They're pretty looking graphs that have a little line that go across it with a green line. And there's not always going to be one direct VPD. There's going to be a couple different ones for any given environment.
Great, thank you. And like I said, everybody, we'll do an in-depth understanding of VPD. So when somebody's talking to you about temperature, humidity. They're talking about those things, but it really comes down to how those impact the VPD, and that's keeping the plant stomata, which is like their little mouths, intaking and exhaling as much as they can in that period of time to promote rapid growth. And the harder those work, the more you can push the plant, the more turns you can get, the better yield you can get. And on top of that, the benefit is staying away from powdery mildew. Number 20, the last one. So what is the most important piece of equipment that I need in my indoor grow space? Well, not really indoor grow space, but any growing at all, it really comes down to the environmental controls are probably the number one place where people fail in their design. You can go out and buy single pieces of equipment to handle any problem that you want: heat, temperature, humidity, lighting. But to get all of those to work together to drive that prime zone, if you will, for growing these plants, you're not going to be able to control it. And on top of that, you're not going to get the results that you want. So really, it comes down to the single most important thing you can really buy for yourself is a good environmental controller. It'll control your lights. It'll take readings and adjust those lights. It'll take readings and adjust the heat, the temperature, the dehumidification, all of those, so that VPD is maintained all time, along with levels of CO2, along with levels of light to drive that plant to its optimal side. Mark, you got any other input there?
Yeah, it's just the biggest part is having it all under one umbrella. Having every piece of equipment in your facility controlled by the same brain is going to be huge. If you have an HVAC system that has its own brain and doesn't talk with, the irrigation system or the lighting system, then you're going to have to control 4 of them instead of a single one. And even then, you can't really get that immediate change from your HVAC system that you want based off of this different light level that your other controller is telling it to do. So having one single brain on the whole operation is going to be huge and just allow you to have that perfect environment that you're looking for in the zone.
That's a great point, Mark, because without it, the equipment actually fights each other. And you might have the heat running and the dehumidification going, or vice versa with the HVAC. And really, this makes them all work together. And that's kind of the end of our frequently asked questions. If there are any questions, please type them in the box. Otherwise, if something comes up later or you want to see something more in depth, you can also reach out to me here at jburgoon@prospiant.com. And Mark and I can get back with you on any in-depth questions that you might have. But otherwise, thank you everybody for attending, and let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark and Johnny. And I will be scheduling the next couple of webinars fairly soon, so keep an eye on the webinar deck as well. All right.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
everyone.
Thanks again, everyone.
Bye.